Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. It's been quite a news day. We had testimony from yet another ousted Inspector General, Christy Grimm, who had the nerve to issue a report that was somewhat critical of Donald Trump and his administration's handling of the coronavirus and the distribution of PPE, personal protective equipment, to hospitals around the country. So, of course, he lost confidence in her and fired her. We had an announcement by the Department of Justice that it would close out the insider trading investigation into some people like Senator Loeffler, but it would continue its investigation of potential insider trading by Senator Richard Burr. Now, unfortunately, that may be a perfectly legitimate way to proceed based on an honest assessment of the evidence, but we have no way of knowing that or having confidence in really anything that Bill Barr's Department of Justice does, because sadly we know that he's in the business of doling out favors to the president's friends and criminal associates, the Roger Stones, the Mike Flynns, the Paul Manaforts, and working to punish the president's enemies or perceived enemies. So we don't know if that is a legitimate call or not with respect to who to investigate for insider trading. We also had the announcement from Twitter today that they will begin attaching a fact check link to Donald Trump's tweets. And I'm sure Donald Trump will take that well. But it's nice to see that what was his kind of unfettered propaganda machine now will at least be evened out a bit. So I think that's a good development. But what I settled on to talk about this evening is silver linings. There's not a lot of consolation to be found. There aren't many silver linings, given that we have sort of lived under this enormous black cloud of crime and corruption and abuse that is Donald Trump and his administration. But I think there are some silver linings sort of peeking out from around the edges of that black cloud. Sure, you have to kind of squint and turn your head sideways to see them sometimes, but I do think that Donald Trump has exposed the weaknesses in our government in a way that will force us to address them in January. If Donald Trump hadn't been just the abysmal corrupt failure of a president that he is, and if he hadn't appointed the sort of least qualified, least appropriate people to positions in his cabinet, then, we might have just kept slouching toward the end of our republic rather than, what Donald Trump has done, which is he's got us sprinting toward the end of the republic. But you know what? He is not going to get us to cross the finish line there. And so I think now that we know just how insufficient many of our institutions are, how they're not up to the challenge of a criminal president, particularly supported by a criminal attorney general, we can go about fixing that in January when we again have a law-abiding president. So, for example, if you have an attorney general who does not abide by the norms and traditions that have generally governed not only the Department of Justice, but the relationship that the Justice Department had with the administration. There was supposed to be some separation there, so the Attorney General represented the interests of the people, not the interests of the president. If you have an Attorney General who doesn't abide by those norms and traditions, well then now we see the sort of devastation that can rain down on the credibility of the Department of Justice and the rule of law generally. So now that we know that, we can go about fixing it in January. When you have a judicial confirmation process run by sort of just a completely corrupt Senate Majority Leader who can cram unqualified judges down America's throat on a simple majority party line vote without those judges really being vetted, like Justice Kavanaugh, that exposes a significant weakness in the system that we now know must be addressed in January, so we don't find ourselves in this nightmare scenario again, where, for example, a Supreme Court nominee can go largely unvetted because the White House basically prevents the FBI from doing a full background investigation or following up on serious allegations of misconduct by a Supreme Court nominee. And then Mitch McConnell can just orchestrate a confirmation proceeding by which Brett Kavanaugh can slither onto the Supreme Court largely unchecked. We now know that our institutions need to be reformed in significant ways to prevent this from happening in the future. When you have a Congress that ordinarily, when it wanted to perform oversight of the executive branch, would engage in what they call accommodation, which is that, we don't have to resort to the formality of subpoenas. We can ask the administration for documents and witnesses and information we need to perform our oversight functions, and the administration will accommodate it. They'll maybe give us some of what we want, not all of what we want, but there will be a give and take between the branches, and both parties will sort of have what they need to fulfill their constitutional obligations. Well, when you have an administration that refuses to engage in any accommodation, also happens to refuse to comply with lawfully issued congressional subpoenas, that's a serious institutional infirmity that we need to fix come January. So thank you, Donald Trump, for exposing all of these significant weaknesses in our government, in our institutions, in our laws, in our norms and traditions, because now we know what needs to be fixed come January. I consider that a silver lining, because now that we know what needs to be fixed, we can go about fixing it, and we will. And thank you, Donald Trump, for appointing completely unqualified nominees to your cabinet. So Donald Trump has made it clear that we probably shouldn't have a Secretary of State who is an abject coward and refuses to support his own people, like Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, against presidential attacks. Remember how Donald Trump said, yeah, she's going to go through some stuff. And then he attacked her by tweet while she was testifying before Congress. We really need somebody in the position of Secretary of State with some backbone and with some honor and with some integrity and with the ability to protect the State Department employees who he is charged with supervising and protecting. We probably should not appoint in the future an anti-public education Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. Thank you, Donald Trump, for opening our eyes to that fact. Nor should we appoint a coal industry lobbyist to head up the Environmental Protection Agency like Andrew Wheeler, because we kind of like to breathe clean air and drink clean water. So thank you, Donald Trump, for opening our eyes to the weaknesses in our system. The same holds true for the Mick Mulvaney's and the Wilbur Rosses and the Steve Mnuchins. Thank you, Donald Trump, for opening our eyes to just how inappropriate it is to put people in place who can't do the job and who won't do the job and are all about self-enrichment and self-aggrandizement and power more than they are protecting the interests of the American people. So thank you, Donald Trump, for exposing all of that to public view, because now that we see how our institutions can be damaged, can be degraded, can be torn apart, we know what we need to do come January. We need to really do two things. I think our mission is twofold. One, it is to hold accountable today's corrupt politicians, and we've got a great start because we've got the Mueller report, which is a blueprint to prosecute Donald Trump for multiple felony obstruction of justice counts. That is going to be, I think, one of the first tasks that should be undertaken in January. And then we need to go about fixing the holes and the deficiencies and the weaknesses of our institutions to protect against a recurrence of what we have experienced over the last 3.5 years. You know, Donald Trump may be determined to burn our government down, determined to end our republic, but we're stronger than him. We're not going to let that happen. We're going to do what needs to be done come January to rebuild and reform. We are going to see a renaissance of ethics and honor and dignity and compassion and kindness because we have learned from where Donald Trump has led us for the last 3.5 years, and we're going to fix it. We're going to fix it. As always, folks, please stay safe. Please stay coronavirus free, and let's try to focus on those silver linings and not just the enormous black cloud of corruption that is Donald Trump and his administration. I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.